Hi data professionals, Morten here from Tabular Editor. In this video we're taking a look at a few of the improvements that we've made in the June release of Tabular Editor 3. First, we're going to look at the general overhaul that we've done of the pivot grid, which makes it much faster to use. Secondly, we've added the ability to save pivot grids locally, which gives some interesting options for reuse across models. And finally, the DAX query has gotten the feature that nobody wants to admit they want: the ability to export to Excel. Let's dig in. The main change that we've made in Tabular Editor 3.16.0, or the June release, is that we've made an overhaul of our pivot grid, making it both easier to use and faster. Let's take a look at what that looks like in practice. Having Tabular Editor open with a loaded model, I can open a new pivot grid here, which brings up the slightly revamped view of the pivot grid. As you can see on the left side, we've added a field list that shows the structure of the model as it would be shown in a pivot grid inside Excel. In the field list, we can browse our model, looking at the different measures that we can find, and we can add those to the pivot grid either by dragging them on to the canvas or by using the fields in the lower left corner. As you can see, there are 4 areas where you can drag into. There is the data area, which corresponds to dropping it into the pivot grid. This is where you put your measures, KPIs, and all those things that you want numbers on. You also have a column area that corresponds to the drop column fields inside the pivot grid itself, a row area, which corresponds to the drop row fields, and finally the filter area, where you can add filters to the pivot grid, verify your measures with those. In the preference pane, there are now options for the pivot grid to choose the kind of field list that you would like to see. So you can also decide whether or not it should look differently or whether or not it should be visible at all. The Tom Explorer still allows for adding pivot grid fields directly into the pivot grid. So we can still use the right-click option and say add to pivot grid for measures, and for columns, add to pivot rows, columns, or filters. You can of course also just drag and drop from the Tom Explorer onto the pivot grid, and from the pivot grid field list, it works just the same. Additionally, you can ask the pivot grid to defer layout updates while working on setting up your pivot grid. Once this is clicked, the pivot grid was first updated when you press the update button. This is especially useful when working on big models or with DAX that you expect to take a long time to render. Now, an important part of working with the pivot grid is the ability to change parameters. So we have also introduced a best fit that will allow you to set the columns to the best fit or even to a specific width that you would like to see. Furthermore, interacting with the cells themselves, you can create different visualizations on them, for example data bars, color scales, or icon sets. And finally, it is from there that you choose a cell which you want to debug to open the DAX debugger. Second feature about the revamped pivot grid that I want to show you is that you can now save them locally on your machine using a new file format that we have added called T3 Pivot. You can use Ctrl S or the Save button to save a pivot grid onto your local machine. The amazing thing is that this feature allows you to reuse the pivot grid across different models or across different sessions of using Tabular Editor 3. So the work that you do in setting up the perfect pivot grid for your model is not wasted. Additionally, having the ability to switch to a different model and test out the same pivot grid against perhaps your production model as compared to the development model makes it a very strong feature. A very cool part of this is that measure names or column names that you have changed will be adhered to by the pivot grid. So the pivot grid, even though you named your measure differently in 2 models, will know that they are the same due to the lineage tag. However, adding new measures to the pivot grid and opening that pivot grid in another model that does not have that measure will result in a warning, and this measure would then be removed from the pivot grid. Let's take a look at what that means in practice. So I have here the pivot grid from before. Just quickly gonna make it look nice with the best fit. And then I'm gonna take my gross sales and I'm gonna rename that to gross sales old, as well as making a duplicate measure that I'm gonna call gross sales new. Because what I would like to do is to change this gross sales and take out the total taxes and commercial fees from it. So I have done that here. I save my model changes back using Ctrl S and add that new measure to the pivot grid. I'm now going to save this pivot grid on my local machine. I'm going to call it release June. And I'm going to open up a different model to see what happens when I reopen this pivot grid within that model. Going to go into open, going to find that release June. And what we first come up with here is that saying that there was a difference in the models because the measure that I added in the old model is not present in the new model. So that measure will be removed. But take a look at this. The gross sales old measure that we called in the previous is still in there just now as with the name that it was before of gross sales. Tabular Editor and the new save function in the pivot grid remembers that lineage tag that ensures that even though there are name changes, the pivot grid is still useful across different models. I think that's a pretty awesome feature that will make it a lot easier to use when testing different measures out in the pivot grid. The final thing that I would like to show you is that we in the DAX query window have added an option to save the output of your DAX query to Excel or CSV. So if we here have a DAX query, we're going to evaluate that and we're going to evaluate the brands table, run the query using F5. And now up here in the query window have an export data option. It also exists up here. And with that, when clicking it, I can export the DAX query and save it locally to be opened in Excel. So I'm gonna save June release, save, and I've exported my data and I can now open that up in Excel. And you can now make your boss happy with all the spreadsheets that he could ever want. Those were the features that I wanted to highlight for you in the new release of June 2024 of Tabular Editor. Let us know what you think in the comments below and by liking the video. If you want to be kept up to date on all things Tabular Editor, do subscribe to our channel. And lastly, do check out our training platform at learn.tabulareditor.com, which will help you make better semantic models faster. Thank you for your support and have fun modeling. Bye now.